Welcome back, everybody, to the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. Co-host Jim Hessler here, and I'm joined today by the artist formerly known as Superfan Jody, and now co-host Jody. Say hi, Jody.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
How you doing today, Jody?
I'm great. It's a little warm.
Funny you should mention that, right? It's a little warm, it's humid out. We're recording this in the dog days of summer, and we are joined by two very special returning guests. Jody, we have not had a lot of guests come back for second or third encores, and actually, in Jeff's case, this is his third appearance.
Wow.
We'll talk about that. But let me welcome our friends back. So we've got two two special guests today for the price of none, because this is a free podcast. But we've got, first of all, Jeff Harding. Jeffrey J. Harding is a licensed battlefield guide like me. Jeff's been a guide for 26 years at Gettysburg National Military Park. He's also an independent historian and leadership consultant. Now, prior to all this, Jeff served 33 years as an intelligence analyst and professional development specialist with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Jeff, that sounds like kind of a big deal.
Um, it was an honor to do it.
There you
It was
go.
an honor.
What well said, with your usual tact and humility. Now, Jeff's published works include Gettysburg's Lost Love Story, the ill-fated romance of General John Reynolds and Kate Hewitt. Jeff and I did a YouTube interview on that, I think about a year or so ago here on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast YouTube channel. So go check that one out and learn a little bit more about John Reynolds. But Jeff likes researching and solving mysteries, including his work on locating the rare World War II Nimitz pen, which was used in the surrender and had been missing since the war. Jeff found it. Right, Jeff? Do I got that
Yeah,
right?
it
Yeah,
was a team effort. Absolutely. I got it rolling, but I was fortunate to work with some great folks, including Admiral Nimitz's grandson. He was a great guy and descendant of the individual Nimitz had given the pen to. And After he'd signed the surrender, and we tracked it down. Yeah. So it was a great,
that's
great ride. And we
well,
had a big event on the Missouri for the 70th anniversary of Penn
Oh,
reunion. And
wow.
yeah, Nimitz' grandson was there, and the other individual was there. Got to watch him hold the pens, and I got to hold the pens. So
wow, that's cool.
yeah, yeah,
I'm holding a pen right now that I stole from the
good,
Marriott, so that's
good,
not
yeah.
nearly as cool. So, all right. All right, so you got mysteries, you got the Nimitz pen, your work on finding the real Kate Hewitt and her
Yeah.
story, which we talked about. But then Jeff's efforts into digging into Michael Jacobs' original weather records led to sort of this ultimate weather god tag team partnership with Dr. John Neese, who's our second guest today. Now, Dr. Neese is a teaching professor and associate head for undergraduate programs in the Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science at Penn State. Dr. Neese also oversees the department's weather and climate communications group, which is responsible for Weather World, the department's long-running weekday weather magazine show. Now, prior to joining the Penn State faculty and getting involved with this Gettysburg weather project, Dr. Neese was chief meteorologist at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philly from 1998 to 2002. And from 2002 to 2005, he was an on-air storm analyst at the Weather Channel. So I think, John, again, you've been here before, but you really are the only guest we've had on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast from the Weather Channel up to this point. So congrats for making the two-timer club on that one.
I'll see what I can do. If you want to get another guest from the Weather Channel, let me know.
We'll see. All right. All right. So we've got Jeff. We've got John. We're here today to talk about their new book that was published this summer from the History Press entitled The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign. So, first of all, welcome back, you guys.
Thank you
Thank you.
for having us, Jim and Jody.
All right, so then why don't we dive right into it? We talked with you a couple of years ago about weather and how it impacted the Battle of Gettysburg, and I got to tell you, if you don't recall, you guys created a social media sensation with the introduction of the wet bulb into the Gettysburg historiography. But before we kind of rehash old news or that, just tell us a little bit about the new book, The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign. What's the book all about?
John, you wanted to go take the lead.
Well, I think the idea, Jim and Jody, was simply to take a look at the whole campaign, June 3rd to July 14th, and as best we could, try to corroborate what the soldiers have been telling us all these years, to try to quantify what had been qualitatively written about in diaries and letters. And of course, there has been some work done on the weather surrounding the campaign, but we wanted to dig as deep as we could, find as many data sources as possible, and use some of the new tools from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to maybe rebuild some weather maps. And this has been a really fun collaboration trying to sort of quantify that 6 week period surrounding the battle.
Touch on the collaboration again. How did you guys hook up? How did you tag team on this and decide to do the project?
Tell you how that thing got rolling. And the moral of the story will be careful answering your phone because you might get a call from somebody someday, and the next thing you know, they occupy the next 4 or 5 years of your life with a project like this. But when I started digging into the records for Professor Jacobs and I came upon the originals, it's exciting. You're digging the stuff. Here's your primary source. Everybody had been relying on an article that his son wrote from the 1880s. So here's the real McCoy. And I'm looking at that data and I'm wanting to know, is there something here that'll lead us to heat index? Because, Jim, doing tours, people are always asking about the heat, and you tell them, well, the best we know, third day of the battle, it was 87 degrees at 2 p.m. And Jacobs only took readings, the individual in town that was recording the weather 3 times a day on behalf of the Smithsonian. It was 87 degrees third day. Okay, great. But what did it really feel like? So I got these records. I'm trying to figure it out. And I said, well, I'm a historian, certainly not a meteorologist. So had read a book that John had written a few years earlier, and he had provided some details about the Smithsonian Meteorological Project and Professor Jacobs in this book. So let me reach out to Dr. Neese. And he was kind enough to answer the call. And I told him what I was trying to figure out. And he had seen these original records himself. A few others had, not many. But he said, took a hard look at it. And he says, Jeff, you're missing what we really need to get at heat index. And that's a measure of atmospheric moisture. And in those days, it's called the wet bulb thermometer. And John can explain that a little to you in a few minutes. But the bottom line is, go back to the drawing board, go back to your database of weather records and see what you can find. Well, fortunately, there were 2 weather observers in Harrisburg, just 35 miles up the road, and both of them did record wet bulb measurements. So we were off and running at that point, and that's what led to our research that unfolded for everyone what it felt like during the battle, especially third day of the battle. At that time, we were focusing on Pickett's charge. That was the hottest afternoon. And so that got our collaboration going, and we've been bouncing back and forth on this thing now, probably since 2018. I was looking through some old emails, and we did this initial effort, and we presented at the Civil War Institute. Our article on Pickett's Charge came out 2022, Civil War Institute 2023. I wrote a separate article. These things all were a springboard to the book, and then so I started leaning on John. And he didn't come hollering and screaming. He came willingly, but he's a busy man. He's still working full-time teaching. And so we took our time, but that allowed me time to do a lot more research into the original accounts, primary sources of what the soldiers were saying. But that's how we got into it in a nutshell.
Okay. So before we get into the science and the wet bulb or that sort of thing, Jeff, you touched on Professor Michael Jacobs and how we as historians have been relying on his time and temperature readings for many, many years. Whenever somebody asks what was the weather like during the Battle of Gettysburg, for the audience's benefit, you would just touch a little bit on who was Michael Jacobs and what, for all these years, has he told us or perhaps not told us about the battle?
Sure, absolutely. So Professor Jacobs was one of the original instructors, founding instructors. at, of course, what was then Pennsylvania College, we know as Gettysburg College today. Also a mover and shaker with the Lutheran Theological Seminary. He's the guy that's largely responsible for the gas lights appearing in town eventually. So this guy's got his finger on the pulse of a lot of things. But for our purposes, and he's a reverend, he's a doctor, etc., PhD. But for our purposes, the weather is what we were concerned about. And fortunately, Jacobs had been observing on behalf of a project that was just specific to Pennsylvania under an individual named James Espy. There was an effort to observe weather throughout Pennsylvania. He was the observer for Gettysburg. This is before the Smithsonian took over this project, and I believe it was the late 1940s, maybe 1840s. But bottom line is he remains the observer, and he's doing this now on the behalf of the Smithsonian. These huge sheets, you can see them in our book. They fill out all the information they can, temperatures, barometric pressures, wind direction, speed in theory, clouds, etc. And so we've got that information thanks to him. And I used to tell people on tours all the time, Jim, you have to think about this. Jacobs lives on Middle Street, and the Confederate line eventually will run through town right on Middle Street, literally on his doorstep.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he continues his duties throughout. So you can read sometimes where people maybe were skeptical a little bit of these civilian observers, if you would consider it that. But he's much more than that. He's teaching science at the college. He's actually got a curriculum on meteorology. So this guy is into it, and he's not going to stop no matter what. So like a lot of these reporters that go out for the Weather Channel in the midst of a storm, but he's in a real storm, right? The largest one to ever take place on the North American continent or Western Hemisphere. The Battle of Gettysburg. That's a storm.
So dare I say, Dr. Jacobs is kind of like the Dr. John Nice of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Well, indeed.
I never went out in storms, but thanks.
Now, did Dr. Jacobs leave anything else behind? I know we talk about his readings during the battle and his weather readings for the Smithsonian. Did he leave any primary accounts? I'm not sure that we touched on that before. Okay.
Yeah, Jody, good question. And thanks for the reminder. So he wrote one of the first histories, if not the first history of the battle, and really was better known for that for years and years. In fact, he made sure President Lincoln had a copy of his book. And he's very, very well known for his efforts in recording the battle, and of course known with his affiliation with the seminary as well.
We know of no instruments, though. His instruments are not accounted for. So
yeah, whatever happened to his thermometers and everything else gone by the wayside. I did get to see a rocking chair. I got to tour the house one time. Well, not the current owners, but previous to that, a law firm was in there, and the individual that owned the home at the time, wife, and I can't remember her name, I apologize. She was one of the earliest women on the guide force, and they hosted me over for a visit and got to go in the basement where they were hunkering down for a while, up in the attic where they observed some of Pickett's charge.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, all that kind of stuff. But I did get a picture of a rocking chair from one of the family descendants that apparently they rocked the babies in there at the house. So
when you went up in the attic today, modern era, could you see anything of the fields of Pickett's charge, or
no,
did trees and buildings
too
block
much
it?
in the way.
That's what I figured.
Yeah, too much in the way, unfortunately.
Okay, so we got a little bit of our background on the way things were, with us all relying on Professor Jacobs. So you hook up with John Nice, and we've already introduced that ever popular term, the wet bulb. You want to, John, maybe pick it up from there, what the wet bulb was, and then how you've taken the science of this maybe a little further. Again, just to remind you, last time I told you I'm not a weather junkie. Your science frightens and confuses me, but just in sort of general terms.
Okay, I can suggest some folks you can see for that disorder, but we're going to be fine here. Well, there's a bunch of ways to quantify the amount of moisture in the air. My guess is that you and Jody and many of your viewers are familiar with the relative humidity. It's often reported on television. And to get that number, one of the ways is kind of clever, actually. And instead of having one thermometer, you have two. But on the second thermometer, you put a little cloth sock onto the bulb of the thermometer, and you wet it. Thus, the wet bulb thermometer. So imagine two thermometers. One of them's a normal thermometer. The other one has a piece of cloth on the bulb that is wet. What's going to happen to the temperature on that second thermometer? Well, water will evaporate from the cloth, and everybody knows evaporation is a cooling process. It's one of the primary ways your body cools itself, through the evaporation of your sweat. You step out of the pool, you feel a chill. Why? Because some of the water on your skin is evaporating and it's stealing energy from your body. So the bottom line is the temperature on that second thermometer, the one called the wet bulb thermometer, will be lower than the temperature on the regular thermometer. And it turns out that if you know the difference between the temperature on the regular thermometer and the temperature on the wet bulb thermometer, you can compute all kinds of interesting things about the moisture content of the air. And one of them is the relative humidity. And one of them is this other measure called the dew point, which 20 years ago, meteorologists were like, when I was on the Weather Channel, we had to be careful mentioning the dew point because we didn't want to overwhelm the viewers. But I think in the last couple decades, folks have become savvy about this. And the good news about this thing called the dew point is it's measured in degrees, so it's understandable. And it's also correlated with human comfort.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's the key here, because as you and Jeff have mentioned, folks want to know, what did it feel like when you combine the effects of the heat and the humidity? And if you know the dew point, then we can answer that question. And unfortunately, as Jeff mentioned, Dr. Jacobs didn't have one of these special double thermometers in Gettysburg. But two observers up the road in Harrisburg did. And you might say, well, Harrisburg's not Gettysburg. What are you going to do with that? Well, with a little more meteorological digging, it turns out that during the days of the battle, the air mass, sort of the weather system that was controlling the weather in Gettysburg, was the same one controlling the weather in Harrisburg.
Okay.
So extrapolation in that case, very reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all we did.
Okay. And I want to interject here for a moment too, because I've encountered people occasionally who, beyond asking us what it felt like on the battlefield, will be like, the weather doesn't really interest me. It's like, whoa, time out. Other than terrain and maybe how much food you have, I can't think of anything that would be more impactful on the human experience than the weather. So,
Absolutely. Jim, two people that said that. One you've heard of?
Yeah.
Charles Fennell. Was kind enough, Dr. Fennell, to give us a blurb, and he pointed out it's the great equalizer. Yeah. One might have better weapons, better equipment, experience. They're all living in the same weather.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was Douglas Southall Freeman. It said, we don't know enough about the weather.
Well, and I can kind of understand that sentiment modern day, because we have modern day amenities. We can go inside to heated houses, air conditioned rooms. But now we're talking about 1863. I mean, their house is the outdoors. And so you can't get away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then how do you take, where do you guys go is then in terms of then taking this wet bulb and the technology or that sort of thing? John, you talked about the dew point and individual comfort levels. How then do you guys marry that with the Civil War research to get a feel for what was it actually like during the Gettysburg campaign? Because I want to emphasize for people, your book focuses on the campaign. It's not just July 1st, 2nd, 3rd.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we ended up doing is going down the road of digging out every primary source we could, Jim, letters, regimental histories, speeches at monument dedication, you name it. We're looking for anything where they mention any aspect of the weather. And so we looked at 1,500 accounts plus over 250 sources to see what the soldiers were saying. That was our ground truth, if you will. And like you get people, you had a few people, so what about the weather? But then you have people that would look at these accounts and be skeptical. Well, wait a minute. Are they embellishing? Are they exaggerating? Can we really take it at face value? And some of the written accounts, they wrote so eloquently back then, it almost sounds like it could be embellished. but we wanted to get at that. We wanted to get it quantified. So once we had those, then we could go back to John's piece, the science. And let me say right now, one of the things I'm most excited about with this book, have been since John and I started, was that man right there is involved. No one's ever worked on anything, as far as I know, with regard to the Battle of Gettysburg, certainly, and probably the Civil War at large, where they actually brought in the services, if you will, of a genuine meteorologist, and not just any meteorologist, but a highly regarded, and believe it or not, easy to work with.
Well, that's not true. But I have to interject here. One meteorologist that I'm aware of did write a paper in a magazine called Weatherwise back in 1960.
Yeah.
America's foremost weather historian. His name is David Ludlam. And he had a story about the weather of the Battle of Gettysburg. And so we certainly want to acknowledge that. And he primarily relied on Jacobs's observations.
Okay.
Second point I think we need to make before we go any further is that, as I'm sure many of your listeners, viewers know, the beginning of the campaign, the armies were near Fredericksburg, Virginia. So they weren't anywhere near Gettysburg. So, and most of Virginia, there was no data. There just isn't any data. The gold mine, as far as I was concerned, and I think Jeff certainly agreed, we found some observations from the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., sort of the gold standard at that time for observations. And they observed the weather 8 times a day, every 3 hours. And they observed everything a meteorologist would ever want. Everything. And so, of course, as the armies are coming northward, they're not that far from Washington, D.C., particularly the Union forces. And so that was the key here. If you wanted to look at the whole campaign, you needed something like these observations from the Naval Observatory. And we relied on those a lot, particularly for the journey north as the armies came north and eventually met in Gettysburg.
Now, when you're focusing on the campaign, was there a big swing in the temperatures and the types of weather they encountered, or did it stay pretty much the same?
Oh, gosh, no. It did not stay the same.
Huge swing, huge swing. And the first week's not too bad at all, but then it got serious in a hurry, didn't it, John?
Yeah, I mean,
so when you say not too bad, what is not too bad for our?
Yeah. So not too bad. Viewers. So it wasn't even, if memory serves me correct, John, warm enough the first week to develop a measurable heat index. Am I right about that?
Right. The way we meteorologists look at this heat index thing, if the temperature is not above 80 degrees, 80, generally speaking, heat index isn't a thing in terms of impacting the body. And yeah, that first week, I think we wrote, was the most benign weather-wise of the entire campaign. I mean, one of our citizen observers in Fredericksburg, she wrote so eloquently, she talked about how nice it felt. And you could just tell, you know, a couple of those summer days, right? Where just the sun is out, but it doesn't feel too humid. And you're like, yes, this is a great summer day. I don't mind sitting out on the porch.
I don't mind giving a tour that day, right?
Right. Good day.
Yeah, we haven't had many of those this summer.
No, we haven't.
Let me mention while I'm thinking about it. There were observers in Virginia before the war. And everybody's probably connecting the dots. But, you know, the war breaks out and nobody in the South is now reporting to the Smithsonian any longer. So you have that gap. There were two observers in Fredericksburg, and official observers. And then we were lucky to find the civilian observer down there.
Okay.
Yeah, during the war, I mean, if you plot a map of where the weather observers are, there's nothing in what was to become West Virginia, and there's nothing in Virginia except for on that sort of northeastern edge where Washington, D.C. sits.
Yeah. Okay. And I think the only other exception for somebody that might want to study, for example, the Virginia and the Monitor clash down at Fortress Monroe, they're observing. So you do have something on the coast there. But of course, Washington, which they called Washington City at the time, was much more valuable for us. And I give a shout out to NCEI. Is that right, John? Down in Asheville.
National Centers for Environmental Intelligence, NCEI.
Exactly. Wonderful individual down there who helped out Janet Wall, she put me on that observatory data. There was a known observer down there who'd been quoted in other works, but that data was typical Smithsonian 3 times a day, not 8 times a day like the observatory. And they had some other, John mentioned some other ways of measuring things that proved crucial to our research as well.
Yeah, and Crick, in his book, which covered the weather in Virginia during the Civil War, correct me if I'm wrong about that, Jeff.
No, you're right.
He used another observer in the DC
Georgetown.
area from Georgetown,
Yeah.
which that observer only measured 3 times a day. So discovering this naval observatory data really, to be honest, made the book possible.
Okay.
We're going to start this campaign. It's really nice and comfortable. And then what happens?
Then, yeah. And actually, Jody, it's interesting because I started calculating this some before John, because he's busy. It's the fall, and I'm working on this, and I'm seeing heat indices is a heat wave in the middle of June, starts on the 15th. And by the 17th, I'm seeing heat indices upwards of 118. And I'm calculating this, and again, I'm not a meteorologist, but am I right about this? So I go back, and he starts looking at it, and lo and behold, this is not just your run-of-the-mill heat wave at this point. Mm-hmm. It's pretty bad, and so much so. And this is where I love the interacting with John, because I would go to him and say, John, I'm looking at these numbers. This thing looks terrible, and he's got all these tools at his disposal. And he's right away, let me do this, and he comes back and begins to unfold for me not only how bad this thing is, but how unusual the circumstances are in terms of having this kind of heat in mid-June in this region. And I'll let John address that.
Well, perhaps it doesn't need to be said, but in the compilation, Jeff created a Word document filled with quotes that were relevant to the weather from hundreds of different sources. And of course, nobody really has a thermometer. I mean, it's all qualitative. So, but back to this heat wave from the 15th to the 18th, just to put it in perspective, I estimated that on the peak of the heat wave, it was the 17th, that the heat index in Washington, D.C. was in the upper 100 teens, okay, which is ridiculous. I mean, on the scale, the impacts to the human body at that kind of a heat index. I mean, in fact, this summer, there have been some heat advisories and heat warnings issued for the Washington, D.C. area, and the National Weather Service threshold is 105.
Okay.
Just to put that in context. So here's what I did. I looked at the hourly data from both Washington airports, modern data going back to the 1960s, from Reagan and from Dulles. And I asked a very simple question. How many times in June has there been a heat index of 117, which was the number we arrived at one of the Washington airports in the modern day? And the answer, 0.
Okay.
So well, even with sort of this urban heat island, the idea that cities are warming things up in their vicinity, a heat index that high just doesn't happen very often. And even in July and August, which of course is the deeper into the summer, it's still very unusual. So from that perspective, and the other perspective is that there were 4 days in a row where the Naval Observatory had a high temperature of 93 or higher. You might say, well, it's summer, this happens, but it's not all that common, even in modern day. And back then, I looked at the 50 years after the war, 1870 to 1920, when we were sort of in a climate, the cities weren't urbanized really yet. So it's comparable and very unusual to have 4 days in a row in June with heat like that. So this was an historic heat wave. The soldiers were not embellishing. And as Jeff, I'll let him add to the story, it was not an equal opportunity heat wave. Right, Jeff?
Absolutely not. So one other thing before I forget is that, and this is sort of the kicker, because a lot of people don't realize that temperature is a shade measurement. Heat index is still a shade measurement. Oh. So the National Weather Service tells us that in the sunlight, you can add anywhere between 10 to 15 degrees. So think about that for a minute, We're talking 117-degree heat index. You tackle, even if you just went with 10 degrees, this is what it feels like. Bless you, Jim. And so they're dealing with this terrific heat. It's the second week of the campaign. Let's go back and look at the history. What happens the first week of the campaign? Well, this is when Lee is very slyly slipping most of his forces away from Fredericksburg, working his way out to the valley and beginning to head north. You have Brandy Station right on the cusp of when we go into the next week of the campaign. But at this point, Hooker, the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac at that time, is realizing he's got to play catch up and he better get moving. And so now most of the Army Corps are on forced marches 20, 25, sometimes 30 miles on the days when the heat is the worst it was during the entire campaign.
Yeah, how long does this record heat then last for? How long does it go for?
Well, by all measures, weather and what the soldiers say, the heat wave ended on the 18th.
Okay.
With some strong thunderstorms, which not all that uncommon in the mid-Atlantic during summer. Every so often you get one of these cold fronts that goes through, thunderstorms, then things settle down a little bit. And that's what happened on the 18th.
On the 18th, and we had these great accounts from the soldiers talking about the terrific hail. I mean, they're getting clobbered by these hailstones. Then we go to the Naval Observatory records. Sure enough, hail. It's recorded on there. So they have the area where they can add comments. And there was even a press report from up by Baltimore where they had some terrible conditions with hail. So
with the distances between the two armies as they're both moving up north, do you sort of see the same experiences in each army or separate? What kind of are we feeling from a Union versus Confederate perspective?
Well, both armies, and we quote in the book, certainly reported on the terrible heat.
Okay.
The difference was that the Confederates weren't marching as much as the Union during the heat.
Yeah,
that's the key.
Okay.
Equal opportunity complainers, though. That's what we always said.
So the record-setting stuff kind of cools off around the 18th. Maybe take us then up to like the 28th to the end of June, as Meade takes command and Lee moves into Pennsylvania. How are things going weather-wise and comfort-wise at that point?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, Jim, the heat's going to abate at that point. And now Hooker's army's largely resting when the weather's most conducive to that hard marching that he just finished. Meanwhile, Lee is spreading out, right? This is the time when they're heading into Maryland, up through Pennsylvania, going east, going north, etc. So they're moving out pretty good, taking advantage of the good weather.
So what were the weather conditions, let's say, from the 28th of June to July 1st for both armies as they're positioning themselves?
As they're getting closer. John,
leading up to the battle, there were a couple days of rain, and it was kind of cloudy, and it was becoming increasingly humid. But it was still not anything like what the soldiers had experienced a couple weeks before. So, couple warm nights, and there were lots of complaints, again, about the weather. But in part, that was because of the distances traveled.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah, because you have instances like where the Second Corps is on a hard march and the Sixth Corps is all over the place. And so these guys are, it's relative. So you got the weather combined with what you're up to. And in this case, even though it wasn't as hot as the heat wave, you had plenty of complaints because some of the distances marched. Again, with the Union Army, you hear from them quite a bit. Specific
Union accounts, specific corps or anything like that seem to be taking the brunt of it more than others?
Yeah, some of the best accounts we have, Jim, are from the Second Corps. And ironically, a lot of the guys in the 1st Minnesota, they wrote about it extensively. Some skilled writers chronicled the events pretty good. So you'll see a lot of those in the book and pictures of some of these guys, too, that I think one thing we're pleased with is we found so many willing collectors of, how it is in the Civil War realm, Jim. Somebody's got a niche for everything. And of course, there's a huge group that collects images, and some of them were very willing to share. So some of the images of these guys that we have in the book that we acquired from collectors, we were tickled to be able to include those in there. Some of the guys that, ideally we'd have a photo of every guy that left us a wonderful account. But there's far too many accounts to have that. But we think it's neat that we have some of those in there.
I think one of the things that's great about the book, and I want to remind people, is again this blending of the personal accounts and the soldiers' stories with the weather experience, that it's not just the scientific readings and things of that nature, although they play an important part.
Did they discuss at all the impact of the weather on the wounded? I mean, most of our people watching know how impactful the weather was on our soldiers who were fighting, but did you find any accounts of that?
For the most part, Jody, if they spoke about the weather vis-a-vis suffering, right, wounds, it would be that the weather's causing these problems more than anything. And it could start with, marching around in the shoes when they're wet. These guys having terrible problems with their feet, that kind of thing. They complained a lot about that, which makes perfect sense, right? But then there's the issue with how many guys are falling out with what was often referred to as sunstroke, heat stroke. They don't have the benefit of what we tell people today. The Weather Service is going to tell you to be careful and take a certain amount of breaks, have a certain amount of hydration relative to how hot it gets. Those things increase, right? And these guys aren't getting quality water, they're not getting anything. And there's a great stat. Someone had asked, did you come up with numbers on the total number of guys? And I'd like to see that study. If somebody gets their arms around that, I want to see it. You see many accounts and numbers thrown out there, but to do a scientific study and get your hands on a firm number, that's tough. But I'll tell you this, in June of 1863, the statistic that comes from us from the medical and surgical history of the United States Civil War is that the Army of the Potomac had 58% of all cases of sunstroke when they only represented 18%, 18.2 actually, of the overall Union forces across the country. So that's significant, and we include that in the book. But what you're speaking of with heat and wounds is going to come into play most acutely during the battle and certainly afterwards. And I don't think anybody's ever really addressed that too much as far as what's that doing to the wounded. It's something that we'll touch on. John and I are continuing our research and work. We've actually got records for August. I don't think anyone's ever used. Jacobs' records for August through December are missing from the Smithsonian Meteorological Project collection, but we found records of his from September through December in another collection elsewhere. And so we're looking at those things to glean what we can. The August records are actually in the Smithsonian collection. They're from Harrisburg. We're looking at those to see how the heat may have impacted things. We're going to identify what the heat was. We're not those kind of, well, John's not that kind of scientist. We'll need doctors to wade in, but I've spoken to a couple. And you go in for surgery, you know that the operating room is what, temperature-wise? Chilly. That keeps infection down.
Right.
So you're operating, you got these battlefield surgeries, and these guys are languishing all night in these tents after the surgeries, and the heat does not relent in August. In fact, it's terrible. No one's ever talked about that to my knowledge. I've been scouring all the firsthand accounts I can get my hands on. And that heat is so terrible, I think that's going to play a role. And I'm just putting this out there. I haven't, no facts to back this up yet. But I think that's going to take its toll on some soldiers that maybe otherwise would have survived or certainly not wrestled with that infection quite as much.
This doesn't directly address your question, Jody, but I want to point out two other metrics that we use in the book that are unique. Jeff mentioned that the heat index is a shade value, and that's a very important point. We meteorologists have another metric to quantify human comfort that doesn't get a lot of airplay. And I think I know why. That's a story for another day. But I first heard it publicly mentioned during the last Summer Olympics, during the marathon.
Yeah.
It's called the wet bulb globe temperature. And without getting into the gory details, basically it incorporates sunshine. So it does the thing that the heat index doesn't do. And it also incorporates wind. Because you know as well as I do, when it's windy, you tend to feel a little more comfortable during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
So we computed this thing called the wet bulb globe temperature a couple times in the book. And the great thing about the wet bulb globe temperature is it's been used for decades by the military and by athletic teams to determine whether their soldiers or their athletes should be practicing outside. So it's actually been used, and it comes with guidelines, how much water you should drink and how much rest you should get if the wet bulb globe temperature exceeds certain values. So we calculate that a couple times in the book during the heat wave and also on the third day of the battle. And one other metric I would like to mention, I praised the Naval Observatory earlier for this gold mine of information. Guess what else they measured at the Naval Observatory? They put a thermometer outside in the sun a couple inches above the ground. Okay.
Oh.
So imagine you're laying down. You're a soldier. You're laying down waiting, with your rifle. This would have been a number that could be applied to a situation like that. And they measured it at the Naval Observatory. Now you might say, well, but the Naval Observatory is 60 some miles from Gettysburg. So those guys during the battle on the third day, they're waiting, they're out in the sun, but they're in Gettysburg. Well, guess what? Jacobs's 87 degrees at 2 p.m. on July 3rd was the same value measured at the Naval Observatory at 3 o'clock that afternoon, which would have been around the beginning of Pickett's charge. Plus, the cloud conditions in Gettysburg and in Washington, D.C. were about the same. And so at 3 o'clock on July 3rd, 1863, the number on that thermometer at the Naval Observatory was 137 degrees, a couple inches above the ground in the sun. So we basically said, you know what? This may not be the exact number, but this can kind of be translated to Gettysburg to give some sense of what it felt like laying in the sun on that third day of the battle.
Wow.
How about that, Jim? Crazy, right?
Yeah, it is crazy.
You guys laying around on the field that day waiting for something to happen.
Or even if you're wounded afterwards, you're laying there in that heat.
Yeah.
That's
right. And the thing is, the soldiers tell us in their quotes that they were forced to lay out in the sun for a couple hours. So we know they were doing it, at least some of them.
So we've jumped around a little bit, and obviously Pickett's charge is sort of that ultimate, what did it feel like on the battlefield question, right, Jeff? Every time we walk it and we lead groups on it. I did want to, though, make sure we covered all 3 days while we had time. And I want to make sure we get into the retreat, because I know that's a big part of what's new for you guys in the book. Give us a quick rundown then on the first and the second day. Last time we kind of talked about temperature readings on July 1st of 72, 76, 74. Gee, that sounds kind of moderate. But last time, John, you were quick to point out that didn't tell the whole story because of the humidity factors. You want to just give us a July 1st overview, and then we'll move on to July 2nd?
Yeah, I mean, the dew point values indicate that it would have felt uncomfortable for the soldiers, but the amount of sunshine on the first day was not that significant, and the temperatures weren't that high. And so the heat index value actually doesn't rise to any level that would have been truly significant on the first day. But the dew point values tell us that it would have been uncomfortable.
Right. And a little rain, John, right? We had the accounts of some rain, Emmitsburg, 11th Corps.
Early in the day, there were accounts coming in from the south of some showers as well. But the Gettysburg Observer, Jacobs, did not report any rain officially on July 1st.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeff, because you see some conflict in terms of rain or not rain on July 1st, and probably depends on where you are. Okay. Compared
to the other 2 days, July 1st was a cloudier type day. A big point that maybe isn't getting enough emphasis here is the weather felt yucky, yes, but if you're not hydrated properly and you're not resting, it's hard to feel anything but yucky. And by many accounts, and Jeff knows more about this than I do, there were dehydration problems on the first, as some of the brigades were still getting to Gettysburg, and there were certainly issues with not resting.
I think that where you really start to get into a new story, Jim, that's significant is on July 2nd,
Yeah.
because we've often looked and said, well, there's a lot of marching going on. You know, the Sixth Corps is coming a long way from the night of the 1st all day through the 2nd. You got Law's Brigade coming in from the mountains. And wait a minute, yeah, long marches, but 81 degrees. What? That doesn't sound too bad for that time of year. And what we found was quite a bit different.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
What did you find that was different?
Yeah.
well, on the second day, when you take into account the humidity, you've got a heat index that's pushing 90. And now that's a number that catches people's attention. That's where the um, you should be resting, you should be hydrating, and as we know, many of them weren't. So July 2nd was a step up from July 1st in terms of the heat index. Um, Interestingly, from a meteorological standpoint, the dew points on July 2nd weren't as high as the dew points on July 1st. You might say, well, I thought you just said it was more uncomfortable. Well, the temperature was higher. And the reason I think on July 2nd that the dew point wasn't as high, I'll give you the 10-second meteorology. There was more sunshine on July 2nd. And sunshine tends to heat the ground, and the ground heats the air. And so the air starts overturning. And so what happens on sunny days sometimes is drier air that's maybe 1,000 feet up mixes down toward the ground. And so the dew point isn't as high. The air actually has a little bit less moisture in it. But because the temperature was significantly higher, July 2nd would have felt more uncomfortable to the soldiers when you combine sunshine, humidity, and temperature.
Yeah, and absolutely. And so, Jim, you know, I'm focusing on these long marches, and John and I are going back and forth on how bad did it really feel that day. And we get to that 90-ish heat index, and the fact that there's some more sunshine and there were some clouds. And I say to John, these type of clouds, because Jacobs will identify what type of clouds. And I said, would they have been keeping sunlight from getting through? Would the sunlight have been getting through? And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but they were the type that the sunlight
Right.
was pretty much going to get through.
Yeah, Jacobs and many of the other observers told us to the best of their ability what type of clouds were in the sky. And I think Jacobs is a pretty trustworthy observer. And he reported the kind of clouds that if you looked up at the sun through these clouds, you would have to turn away immediately. They were so thin that they let most of the sun shine through. So even though there were clouds, they were thin, high clouds that allowed most of the sun through. The point is that cirrostratus and cirrus clouds are thin clouds, and they would let most of the sun shine through. So if you've got a 70% covered sky with cirrostratus clouds, trust me, a lot of sun is getting through.
Okay.
And that's where the ping pong ball bounces back to, all right, you got 90 heat index. The sun's adding how much? 5, 10, 15 degrees. So I think the case could be made that, you know, when Law's boys are on the hard march and Sedgwick, that feels like might be getting up there out in the sun, at least up closer towards 100. So you start to re-examine this whole thing. And then you say, well, who fared better in this deal? And you go back and look at the accounts, Jim. And what I found in reading all the accounts I could get my hands on, and some secondary wonderful pieces, Gary Edelman and different folks have written about this in Gettysburg Magazine. The Sixth Corps is getting more frequent breaks. Not that they're taking breaks every hour. Maybe frequent's not the best word. Occasional breaks. And they're getting hydration more often than Law's Brigade. Law's Brigade doesn't seem to get any hydration. Remember, these guys are in enemy territory. There's nobody coming out to greet them with buckets of water like happened for the Sixth Corps in Littlestown. So I think that's a game changer for the condition these guys are going to be in when they get to the field. And the historians know what happens to Law's Brigade when they arrive. You know, it's a brief respite, and now you're falling in for the march, which becomes the counter march, which becomes 4 p.m., empty canteens, and you haven't gone through the worst part of your day yet, believe it or not. How did these guys end up at the tip of the spear? And the irony is they are at the tip of the spear, and the worst is yet to come. Sharpshooters, big round top, and then that fateful break because of all of that, the cumulative effects. And did it make a difference? because when did Chamberlain go in? And you might argue what might have happened had Oates been successful there. That's another story. But the fighting ability, capacity that they have left in the tank, you certainly have to consider the weather. So I think it opens up those discussions. Even with Pickett's charge, you got
Yeah.
to look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to anybody who's like, oh, I'm not really interested in the science aspect of it, a direct impact on the outcome of the battle, as it does in any military campaign.
Yeah.
But we're
Play a
focused on
video game then.
Gettysburg. Yeah.
Because if you're indoors, then there's no weather and you can play your video game all day, but they're operating in the real deal.
Yeah.
So
Or
basically, most of your, famous conflicts on day 2 and day 3 are going to take place when it's the hottest, is what
Yeah,
you're both
how
saying.
about that?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
And
so the
really,
weather gods are beginning to play their game, aren't they? Yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of what I was kind of going for earlier with the first day comment, because if you really think about it, look, anybody who lives in South Central Pennsylvania, unless things have changed radically from 1863 to 2025, knows that sort of in that 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock window every afternoon is the yuckiest. And you have the Union line falling apart at that part in the afternoon of July 1st. You have your heaviest fighting after 4 o'clock on July 2nd. And the meat of Pickett's charge on July 3rd is 3 p.m. It's right in that maximum window.
Absolutely. And the other thing, John and I have been discussing this, and we mentioned it in the book, it doesn't cool off at night as the
Yeah.
battle progresses. Each night's more and more uncomfortable. And that's a key factor in your body's ability to recover. Right, John?
Yep. Yep. It never, I believe that Jacobs at any observation time never measured a temperature lower than 70.
Okay.
Of course, we know that he was observing at 7 a.m. and the lowest temperature often occurs right around sunrise. And so could have gone below 70 briefly, but yeah, the nights were warm.
So, Jim,
For
you
sure.
like these terms like the wet bulb and wet bulb globe. There's one that we didn't touch on that we talked about before, and it's been in the news a lot lately. Probably not hugely significant at Gettysburg, but crop sweat or corn sweat.
Okay.
And I think it's neat when you start looking at the fact that, we have our crop maps. Every battlefield guide should have it, right? And you can look at where the corn was growing. Might have added to that heat index factor that much more, and we kind of incorporated that. But it's off subject a little. But John hit me with some really interesting information the other day, because this is vintage Jeff and John. And I'll throw these things out, and then John's digging, and he comes back with this really cool stat on what they've been going through. I don't know if you've seen in the news at all with this heat wave hitting the nation in Iowa. It's been really bad, especially where they have these thousands of acres of corn growing. John, what was that roughly the heat index or the
Well, the concept here is pretty straightforward. Plants transpire, they add moisture to the air, and so they could theoretically increase the dew point.
Hmm.
And it's pretty clear when you look in the Corn Belt, particularly when the corn is mature, as it is around now, that the dew points in the Corn Belt are unusually high. I mean, it sticks out like a sore thumb. Unusually high by of order maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees higher than anywhere around.
Anywhere else.
It's because of the corn.
So at the end of the day, too, if you're wounded and you're lying in the wheat field, for example, or any of those areas, it's going to be hotter down where you're laying because of the wheat or the corn or.
Well, it'll be more humid.
Okay.
About hotter.
It'll feel more oppressive.
It'll feel more oppressive. I'll go with that. Now, wheat doesn't transpire as much as corn does. Corn is sort of the leading transpirer here. But yeah,
Okay.
the bottom line is on the battlefield, we know where they were planting corn and oats and wheat. And I'm comfortable saying that it had to have felt more uncomfortable among these crops than it would have on the streets of Harrisburg or Gettysburg.
How about in orchards? Because we have to get our Dan Sickles report in here with
How about peaches?
I like
yeah.
that.
I I mean, I kind of phrasing that as a joke, but at a serious level, do orchards and the trees and everything clump together? Does that have any impact?
Yeah, any living thing transpires. I'm not an expert in
Okay.
transpiration rates. but any living plant, yeah, any living plant is going to be part of the issue here.
Okay.
The question is, what is the magnitude? And I don't think the magnitude is anywhere near what it would be in the Corn Belt during the summer, but there could be some small contribution.
Okay. And that concludes today's edition of the Dan Sickles Report. Thank
Okay.
you, Dr. John. All right, so I want to make sure we get to the retreat because I know that was part of your focus, but I don't want to leave out anything good that you feel like we've missed. So July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, of course, again, the work on Pickett's charge. Is there anything about the 3 days of the battle that you guys want to cover that we haven't talked about here before we sort of move on to the retreat and aftermath?
I think really the only thing, and it kind of segues into the aftermath, Jim, is the rain that Jacobs did or didn't record initially on the 4th. Jim, John, you've got Jacobs pulled up there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting. We praise Jacobs for his observations. I mean, amazing that we have these numbers. But we do know that Jacobs's son reported a thunderstorm later in the day on the 3rd. And other observers, soldier observers, did as well. But there's no official rainfall measurement on Jacobs's sheet for the 3rd. It could be that it rained and he forgot to enter it. It could be that it thundered, but it never rained at the Jacobs residence. It could be that he was just too busy. But the bottom line is on the 4th, Jacobs tells us that at 6 a.m. in the morning, he observes rain. And between the 4th and the 5th, Jacobs records 1.39 inches of rain, which is a significant amount. That's a big dump of water from the sky. It did not. It rained in the aftermath, but not because of the battle. Let's make sure we don't give anybody a false
We
impression.
get that question a lot.
Yeah,
well, that's a fair point. Let's stop there for a minute and address that because that's a great point. You know, we get that a lot.
It's coincidence.
There's no science behind that old myth at all.
No.
Okay.
There's just not enough smoke in the air. The particles in the air don't get high enough.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's not happening.
Okay.
So
Shelby Foote was wrong on that.
Yeah,
well, I don't know what Shelby
I don't know.
said.
I'm just making that
Was
up.
there a rainbow on the battlefield, Jim? That's another one, and we were actually looking into it. We had all kind of little box sidebars that didn't get in the book, but there's at least one sighting, maybe two, if memory serves. And as you know, you'll see rainbows on the battlefield, but that's where I go back to John, and we like, could this have even been possible? He said, well, what was the sun, what time of day, this kind of thing. So
it was very possible.
But you would have thought there would have been a lot more accounts of it had they seen
Right.
one.
It's very possible there was a rainbow, but I would have expected more soldiers to write about it.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty sure there was just one that we found. But
now, in your research, the retreat is traveling down through Maryland. Were you able to find measurements from Maryland, or did you still go by Dr. Jacobs'
John,
measurement?
let me jump in for a second, then I'll let you get into the nitty gritty. So, Jody, I mean, I'm looking for the Holy Grail because we've always relied on Jacobs. His numbers were the only ones we had. And when I read the descriptions of the rainfall and what's happening in the mountains and on the retreat, and when we know what happened at the Potomac River, it's killing me because I'm like, it's got to be more rain than Jacob. John said there was a lot of rain, but
yeah, because they're talking about all this flooding. So I was wondering if there's more rain south. Yeah.
And that word is bannered about. And, was it really a flood? What was it? So this is one thing I'm pinging on John about, and I'm researching. I'm looking at the weather observers in the Smithsonian Meteorological Project. So we got Jacobs, we got Harrisburg, there's an observer in Frederick, Maryland. But he doesn't observe. What was it, John? He observed in June. We don't have anything from July.
Right.
There's an observer out in Sykesville on the way to Baltimore. So we use that, and we're using all the ones we can get. So I go, all right, what about on the retreat? Well, there had been a Smithsonian observer at Chambersburg. Wouldn't that have helped? There was one in Winchester. That might have been helpful. And guess what? There's one in Leitersburg. Some people might not know where that is. It's right outside of Hagerstown.
It
Man,
is, yeah.
talk about a gold mine. Where is it? Well, that guy, the other ones aren't observing at that time any longer. But the guy in Leitersburg, I have an article from a local Hagerstown newspaper that tells me he was still recording rainfall measurements in 1863, even though he wasn't reporting to the
Okay.
Smithsonian.
Wonderful.
However, those records, to the best of my ability, and believe me, I reached out far and wide, cannot be found. But I always bring it up because somebody out there might find them. Please go find them. You'll make my day, maybe my year. But so we had to get at it another way. What are we going to do? And we knew that General Imboden had said when he got to Williamsport, he's looking at a river that's 10 feet above normal fording.
And a lot of mud.
And a lot of mud. And so we're putting together that the river's somewhere at a 15 to 20 foot range. And I begin to think about this, and I'm saying to John, how can we get at this? And lo and behold, I get a note from a historian, great guy, Tim Snyder, out in the Williamsport region. And he's telling me that this is April 2024. Jeff, did you see this picture online? Somebody took a picture. The river is flooded, and it's, pretty high right now, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, okay, go back to John. What was the river level at that time? And then, John, how much rain did it take to create that kind of problem out there? Now, there's been a lot of changes between 1863 and 2025, 2024, but I'll turn it over to John to tell you how we got at that.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear in summarizing, there are no observers south and west of Gettysburg during the retreat.
Yeah.
There just aren't.
Unfortunately.
We know it rained a lot in Harrisburg. We have those numbers, but upriver of Williamsport, where Lee was trapped, there are no observers. So what do you do? Well, all we did was, if we assume the river was somewhere above 15 feet, 15 to 20 feet, and you want to know how much rain it takes for the river to get to that level, just find some recent occurrences when the river at Williamsport rose above 15 feet in that 15 to 20 foot range. We found three what I would call modern proxies when the river got in that range. And I simply mined the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration databases to come up with how much rain occurred in the days prior to those modern times when the river got between 15 and 20 feet. Kind of reverse engineer the problem, and the answer comes back that a rainfall of 3 to 4 inches over a couple day span is enough. Again, all things are not equal here, comparing to 1863, but at least we got in the ballpark that 3 to 4 inches of rain was enough to raise the river level to where it was at that time. And then Jeff had this fortuitous opportunity to get a picture of what the river looks like in modern times between 15 and 20 feet. And then we also have pictures of what it looks like modern times at normal level. And so we put those side by side in the book so you can see kind of what it looks like normally, which is kind of what it looked like when the troops were coming north, and then what it looked like when they were trapped in Williamsport.
And I think it was really cool. We did a presentation for the Sacred Trust, Jim, and that's a big screen, right? And we brought up full-size image of the river at 15 to 20 feet. And what we started with it at Normal said, well, this is what Lee was hoping for. And we took the pregnant pause, and then we said, here's what he found. Nice. And it's a game changer. I want to cite something out of the book, page 180. Beautiful chart John put together here of the rainfall between July 4th and July 14th at the various sites where we did have data. So you have the 2 Harrisburg sites, you have Sykesville, you have Gettysburg, and then you have some others, the observatory in DC, you have Georgetown, Annapolis, and Pittsburgh. But the interesting thing is it shows the variance. For instance, Gettysburg, between those dates, the grand total is 3.24 inches.
Okay.
You look at Harrisburg, you've got anywhere between 8.9, one observer, and another one 11.85 inches. So that's not to say that it that much fell at Williamsport. We got a better idea what would happen, but that's to show you how it varies widely. And John kept making the point to me that, Jeff, we can get at these temperatures, but there's so many variables involved with rainfall, and there's so much localized. And John, hopefully I'm not saying that incorrectly, that it's much tougher to get your arms around that.
I mean, everybody's experience tells you that in summer, you could be on the phone with your best friend who lives 5 miles away, and they're talking about a deluge, and you're looking outside and the sun is out.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all had
Yeah.
our kids' soccer games or baseball games canceled because the field was a quagmire, and where you live, there was barely a sprinkle. So you get this wide variation in summer that makes it challenging to extrapolate from any numbers you may have.
You know, I'm glad you said that, John. And I just want to point out for people, because I've experienced that. I live on the north side of Gettysburg, and I'll be talking to somebody south of town, and it might be raining here and not raining there. And I think
Yeah,
that's a reminder to people that you're trying to get what was the weather like in Gettysburg, and even that is not always going to be equal. So it's a good
right,
point.
right.
Yeah. And Jim, I'm going to go NASCAR on you for a minute. Always kills you if you watch NASCAR, guy wins a race and, he's thinking every sponsor that's on his little jumpsuit and the whole nine. So we're not going to go down that road all the way. But I wanted to say that aside from Tim down there, Sandy Iser works down there at Williamsport. She got us a number of great photographs as well. And one thing we were really tickled with the support we had in the book, I think, for your audience. Most of them know John Heiser, and he was
Mm.
kind enough to carve time out of his schedule to create some wonderful maps for us. And then Dale Gallen, some original drawings that are in there. So something else we were tickled to be able to bring to the audience.
And so then maybe kind of wrapping some of this up, though, did the science and your research and did your work, it seems like it's confirmed a number of commonly cherished beliefs we've had, but were there any, whether it's the battle, the marching, the retreat, were there any long cherished notions that you guys kind of just more or less were able to dismiss because of this combination of science and history?
Boy, that's a really good question that we have not been asked.
It's kind of the reverse of what we looked at. So were we able to dismiss any long cherished notions? I think for us, it was more about building upon what people may have thought. So maybe
Okay.
the notion that it wasn't so bad on July 2nd. We think we've proven that it was worse than people knew. We think the same's true for Pickett's charge. We think that we can talk a little more from an educated point of view about what was taking place on the river. And we didn't talk about this, but just like that heat wave was quite unusual, when John and I started looking at the data on what happened on the river, we found out more or less, John, right? The same thing was true.
Yeah, the the available data goes back into the 1990s on the water level at Williamsport. And in a nutshell, the water levels that Lee experienced in July of 1863, there are no instances in the month of July going back to the 1990s of the river being that high at Williamsport. Now, that's only 30 years worth of data. Got to be careful. But I was surprised that the river at Williamsport has not been that high, anywhere near that high
Wow.
in the month of July. In the
John,
last, so
we had that Gilbert book too, David Gilbert's book, wonderful book about, I forget the exact title of it, but wonderful resource. His research was impeccable on the status of the development on the river, Harper's Ferry. And he looked at all the historic floods that have ever hit and different things. And it was interesting that what happened in July didn't make that book. So we were like, well, wait a minute, was it a flood or was it not? And we coordinated a lot with some contacts John had it know, and we're able to determine that at Williamsport, to be a true flood, it's got to be over 25 feet. So it was very high water. It was apparently pretty rare. And we knew that much, but we knew also that if you see it referred to as a flood, That's not necessarily the case. It
Mm,
was bad, certainly, and the water was up over the banks and in the floodplain. And you read the accounts; they had to move the wagons and guys' tents and everything else because that's where they were waiting to cross. But yeah, so we didn't like any good students writing a book. You don't get your title first, right? You let it come to you.
right.
And this title came to us because the more we looked at the unusual things that happened, the circumstances, you realize, wow, this couldn't have happened at a more inopportune time weather-wise. So that's how we got to the weather gods cursing the Gettysburg campaign.
I hope that's a great segue for a question that has been on my mind. John, in particular, you've touched on this a couple times in your answers, and I want to be clear to both of you guys and to everybody listening. This question is not a political statement in any way, shape, or form, but I want to put it in context of weather in history. We hear so much about it's hotter in 2025 than it's ever been in climate change and that sort of thing. And I'll attest to the fact that, yes, it is bloody hot when you get out onto that battlefield. But if we're trying to draw some sort of parallel 2025 to 1863, even allowing for a number of these unusual occurrences that you've talked about, when you measure all of this, heat index, wet bulb, temperatures, whatever measurement you want to use as a weather professional, do you feel like what we're experiencing right now in the summer of 2025 is same, different, or dramatically worse than what they experienced in the summer of 1863?
Well, to be clear, I mean, climate change is real, but that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that every subsequent year is going to be warmer than the previous year. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. Um, this has been quite a warm summer. Uh, I think the numbers indicate that this summer, if you want to make a direct comparison between the summer of 2025 and the summer of 1863, at least in the area covered by the um, uh, Gettysburg campaign, I don't think there have been any extremes similar to the heat wave in terms of the heat index getting to 117. Um, but overall, the summer has been warmer. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The consistency of the warmth since the middle of June far exceeds the consistency of the warmth during that summer. I mean, they had during the campaign, as we pointed out, there were periods of relative comfort. And there haven't been many periods of relative comfort so far this summer in the mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, it's our fault. It's the book and the fact that I'm having to cut my own lawn this year. And that's exactly why we're having this kind of heat, I'm convinced.
Yeah, and because I'm doing more Pickett's Charge tours too, it's all kind
Yeah,
of coming
exactly.
together. The weather gods are cursing the summer of 2025 as well. Okay, guys, this has been great to have you again. Man, we could go on for probably another 30 minutes or an hour, but I know we've got some other commitments here. John Neese, Jeff Harding, our friends, the weather gods curse the Gettysburg campaign out from History Press. Cannot thank you guys enough for joining us again today.
We thank you both. It's an
Thank
honor
you,
to be on your
gentlemen.
program. You guys do
Thank
a
you.
great job. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jim. Thank you, Jody, very much.
Thank you guys for taking the time out. Jody, thank you, of course, for joining me again as co-host. Always appreciated. And
No problem.
folks, this has been the Battle of Gettysburg podcast on YouTube. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to y'all soon.